Bryan Caplan is a professor of economics at George Mason University and a research fellow at the Mercatus Center. Known for his unconventional viewpoints, he's the author of several influential books, including The Myth of the Rational Voter, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, and The Case Against Education. Bryan is an outspoken individual with strong, sometimes controversial viewpoints on some of the most important issues of our times, including education, immigration, and of course, economics. Thanks for taking the time to talk today, Bryan.
My great pleasure.
Why don't professors with tenure say more controversial things given their job security? Do you think it's social, or have all their controversial opinions gone to the wayside after the conformity required to get tenure in the first place?
Great question. I think the first thing is most professors don't have controversial views. Most professors are actually, at least relative to their occupation, very conformist. I mean, you might say that professors tend to be very left-wing, which would be controversial with the general population. I mean, I would actually say that most professors who are outside of humanities and social sciences, they're more left-wing just as a matter of default. I don't think they even think about it all that much. So if you don't have that much controversial to say to begin with, it's not like when you get tenure, you're going to rip off the mask and reveal something, because there's not much to reveal. I think you are right, though, that over time, people tend to just become so bland and conformist just to fit in, right? And what's strange is that even if you are in a highly activist discipline like women's studies, people don't like being around a person who's yelling at them all the time. So even that tends to be beaten out, and people tend to retreat to vague, rambling, terrible prose, which even if you were paying attention, you might say, well, this is actually saying something really controversial. You do have to be paying attention. And when it's long and rambling, people don't pay much attention. So, then on top of this, of course, the longer you have a tenure, the older you are, older people tend to have less, at least a fewer controversial views that they want to talk about. Maybe they really do have fewer controversial views. But honestly, most academics, they're narrow specialists, and most controversial views have to be fairly general in order for people to even understand what could be controversial about them.
Of the professors with controversial views, isn't it actually their incentive to say more controversial things because they spent a career building the social capital required to actually say these things in the first place? And now they're finally in a position such that like they won't actually get fired, or they won't get too ostracized if they say something controversial.
It would be easy to think that because the most famous professors usually do have controversial views, but they're not necessarily, I would just say, like, generally the most successful people are the ones that play the game rather than ones that are actually famous. In terms of salaries and professional esteem, a lot of the most successful professors in the world are people that almost no one has ever heard of. It's someone working at Yale on upper hemiconvexity and its role in economics or something like that. You're like, what? And yeah, I remember actually there was one professor, I think it was at NYU, and someone was telling me what his letter writers for tenure said. And one of the letters said, there's probably only 5 people alive who can understand this guy's work, but those 5 people are very important. And that gets you a salary of $500,000, right, for life. Now, if you're wondering what's going on, well, here's the thing. The way the professors generally rise is by doing highly specialized work, usually in academic journals that it can only be understood by other specialists in your field, or people that go and write university press books, which are, again, written for other specialists in your exact field. That is the normal path to success. When you hear about somebody like Steven Pinker, he's someone who started off on that path, and then he got tenure and then broke free and became something else, became a public intellectual. What I would say is that those people probably do make the very largest salaries on to sell books that people actually read and therefore sell copies. Are the ones who get great speaking gigs. Normally, the only way a really boring professor can get a speaking gig is by winning a Nobel Prize, something like that. Then finance firms will pay you to ramble, and they'll $50,000 to go and talk about your boring garbage. Right? But otherwise, you really can't make money off that stuff. But the normal path to success is just to remain a specialist. And I would say that's the safest one. Out of people that really want to be public intellectuals, that was my goal all along. But for those people, they really do need to play the game reasonably well until they get tenure at least. And the honest truth is most people who can play that game are just too boring to do anything else. It's quite unusual that someone both can excel at this highly specialized insider game, then get tenure, then actually say, I'm good at that game, but that's not my game. It's sort of like Michael Jordan becoming famous as a basketball player and then says, now I'm going to be a baseball player. He did try, but as far as I understand, he wasn't good enough to really be a professional baseball player, even though he was probably amazing as a baseball player compared to a normal person.
What's always struck me as odd is the relatively few number of verbal assessments throughout education, especially given the relative importance of verbal intelligence during one's career, for interviews and day-to-day interaction.
Yeah.
Why
so
aren't
like oral exams are rare? That kind of thing?
Yeah, oral exams. I guess in grad school you have that after your second year or whatever. But why aren't institutions, especially ones considered less prestigious, even trying to innovate in this area?
Why are they not trying to?
Why aren't they? Like they should be.
So, I mean, there's a few things going on. One is that it's just a lot of work to do oral exams. Basically, you've got to dedicate 5 or 10 minutes to every student. It's just a lot easier to give standard written exams where you don't have to spend that time. And honestly, the oral exam could go on for like half an hour for every student. Professors don't want to spend their valuable research time on assessing students, especially when there's really no pressure from anyone to do it in any other way. Students are generally not going to like this. It's a rather stressful part. And furthermore, when you are grading people, honestly, the more distance you have psychologically from the person that you're not saying is great, the better the professor feels. So if you can anonymously fail someone, that's one thing. To fail a person to their face, you got to be quite a steely-hearted person to do that. Now, why is it that lower ranked schools aren't trying to innovate in this way? I mean, I think you really have to look at the incentives of the people involved. The person that really has to innovate or that is responsible is the professor. Almost all professors' awards come from research, not teaching. If you're wondering, well, why is that? Why is there such a focus on research rather than teaching? Ultimately, it comes back to the fact that academia is a bunch of workers' cooperatives. The people that decide whether an economist should be promoted are his fellow co-worker economists. The people decide whether you're a good enough English professor or your fellow English professors. They're the ones that matter. Now, as to why we set up this crazy system where the only opinions that really matter are those of your immediate coworkers, well, there I'm just going to say that the nonprofit sector doesn't work. We started off this way, and there just is almost no pressure to change. Anyone who did suggest change would just be making enemies with very little gain for themselves. You might say, well, doesn't the university president want to make a school rise? If a university president can make a school rise at minimal effort, minimal cost, then sure. But if the university president has to alienate his faculty in order to make the school rise, well, they don't pay him enough for that. And particularly, they don't pay him a salary that varies enough with the performance of the school for him to do that. Typically, university president gets like $1 million a year. But if he goes and becomes known as a big innovator in student assessment, does he get a raise? No. Does he make enemies? Totally. There's going to be a whole bunch of professors who don't like what he's doing and will resist and resent and complain. Plus, the students probably are not happy as well. They don't like this humiliating fact that they have to do an oral exam. So I just say that we're locked into a system with very dysfunctional incentives. All of it sustained by massive taxpayer and donor subsidies.
I agree with you on the professor section, but aren't there legitimate incentives for administrators to play more games? Like I think in recent memory, we've seen Northeastern has been trying to lower their acceptance rate to increase their rate of prestige. And maybe that's not internalized by the president wholly, but it would seem that there should be more incentive for the schools that are getting squeezed out to try more innovative tactics to attract more students or to play more numbers games.
What I would say is that a school like Northeastern is the exception that proves the rule. Most university presidents are not trying hard at all. Although notice that even the thing that you're talking about is one of the easiest things for a school to do. What happens to the university president if you reject more students? Well, you don't meet the rejected students. You don't have them cry in your office. They just never show up. That's one of the lowest cost ways to go and make your school rise in prestige, is just to be harder on people that never set foot on campus in the first place. The people you have to worry about are the people that you rub shoulders with. the students that are already on campus, the faculty that are already there, the other administrators. Those are the people that, if they are angry, your life is bad. So why should you go and make yourself suffer in order to raise the rankings of the school when your salary basically has nothing to do with it? In fact, probably donors will take the side of the rest of the university when they're complaining about you. Honestly, it's like, what's wrong with your school? Everyone hates you. It's like, well, they hate me because I'm doing a great job. Whereas if you're the CEO of a for-profit corporation, everybody knows that a big part of making profits is making enemies and making people unhappy, because you're not there to go and serve the biggest complainer. You're there to make money. So therefore, yeah, like of course, the path of least resistance is to say anyone who has a job here gets to stay here. But the path of profit, on the other hand, is to say, well, if you don't really help us at the company, we're going to get rid of you. I mean, even in private business, you'll often see CEOs that let that ride or let it slide because it's like, well, I don't want to feel like the bad guy. But what's remarkable really about the for-profit sector is they actually do give people incentives to take actions that are good for the company, but are psychologically hard, not just for other people in the company. It's hard to be the boss. I mean, like Mr. Burns, when he has the sadistic joy of fire that man Smithers, that is almost no one on earth. Normally, people don't like firing others. It's considered to be one of the hardest parts of the job to give any kind of negative feedback. But if someone gets $1 million for firing another person, then often they'll do it.
Do companies that quickly fire underperformers produce excess returns? If so, is it a problem of identification of the right people to fire? And can you just hire consultants to fire them to separate yourself by 1 degree?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I'd say that we know best is that it is totally standard after a takeover for there to be massive firings. I think that's one of the best signs that there is underfiring going on and that this does yield higher returns. Now, as to why it is that you don't just outsource it to consultants, of course, this is a common story that, well, he really wants to get rid of people, but he tries to avoid blame by having consultants say it. This is the whole theme of the George Clooney movie Up in the Air. If you've seen it, it's quite good. Yep. I have researched that movie. Literally, there is no such thing as someone whose only job is to fire people. So that part of the movie is exaggerated. It's one of the menu of activities that companies like that offer. As to why it is that more of this doesn't go on, it's because you may reduce your perceived culpability by outsourcing it to consultants, but nevertheless, it isn't anywhere like a full solution, and people will get angry at you and hate you for that. Really, the story that makes sense is that people that get to know their workers that have been there for a while, then they start getting loyalty to the people they see every day versus shareholders that are not nearly as present. And then you need to have an outside person come and take the company over who doesn't have these bonds of loyalty to get the company back on track. Now, as to why that doesn't happen, there are so many regulations that try to prevent hostile takeovers. It's just a giant pile of effort to ensure the continuation of inefficiency. The old movie standard where you just get 51% of the stock and then you do whatever you want, that's not the system that we have anymore, which means that if there is a company that has a bunch of advantages but a bunch of problems, it's going to stay in business, and probably the current leadership will stay in charge.
To what extent do early life experiences influence the level of intellectual curiosity in adulthood? Or is intellectual curiosity more driven by genetics?
Good question. Here we've got a lot of research in twin adoption studies on personality. Curiosity, if I'm not mistaken, is one of the main facets in the Big Five trait of openness to experience. The usual behavioral genetic estimate for personality traits is something like 40 to 60% of the variance explained by genetics, and then 40 to 60% by non-shared environment, and then about 0% by upbringing. Now, what is non-shared environment? It's just a residual. It's not genes. It's not the home you grew up in. Then it's something else. A lot of people who know this research get these ideas from Judith Harris's book, The Nurture Assumption. But I say that that book is widely misinterpreted because here's the thing. Where that book puts a lot of emphasis on peers versus family. But insofar as your family causes you to have one kind of peer versus another, behavioral genetic methods will actually allocate that effect to family environment. So, for example, if you live in a rich family, the rich family puts you in a rich neighborhood, that gives you rich friends. The actual mathematics of the system will assign those rich friends to a parenting effect. If you just imagine you get adopted by one family versus another, that family is not just the immediate things that happen inside the walls of the house. It's everything caused by being adopted by that family rather than another family. Now, this doesn't mean that experiences are unimportant. It just means that the experiences are not the kind of experiences we're thinking of, or at least they don't have the same reliable direction of effect that we think. When you see these very low effects of upbringing on personality traits in general, not just curiosity, but including curiosity, one interpretation is that family just doesn't have any effect on these things. And that's pretty big, because it means anything that family affects doesn't have any effect. Right? But another story is just that the direction of the effect can be positive or negative. It could be that if you're in a curious family, that causes you to be curious, but other people have the opposite effect, and being in the curious family will make them resent these curious people and go the other direction. Thinking about my own life story, I'm very inclined to believe the perverse story that sometimes family has the opposite effect. So people in my family were not intellectual, really not interested in ideas. My dad is a PhD in engineering, but he's not curious. He's someone that is a practical doer. His hobby is antique car collecting. And in the hobby, the way that you get prestige is by restoring the car to be exactly the way it originally was, without the slightest deviation from the way it came out of the factory. And that's what his hobby is I got to get this exactly the way it was in 1940. There's no room for curiosity really in this hobby, other than curiosity about, well, how was it in 1940? But that's all you've really got. A story that I will tell about myself, which is hard to know, but I do tend to think that a lot of what was going on when I was a kid is I was rebelling against this very uncurious family by getting into things that they were not into. I rebelled against my family by listening to piles of opera, which just horrible, well, they didn't like it anyway. What is that horrible stuff? And in fact, decades later, my dad said, I was worried you were gay. I know only gay men listen to opera. I'm like, no. And he was like, well, that's what I think. Right. So there's that. So ultimately, probably the genetic effect is very clear. As to whether family matters or not is open. I do think it's plausible that family can either have the intended effect or the reverse effect, which then masks the fact that it does matter, but just not in the normal, standard, assumed way.
This suggests that you don't subscribe to the theory that the education system today squashes intellectual curiosity and does not incentivize that.
It could. I mean, here's the thing is, if there's very little variation, then we just don't know what's going on. So what could be happening instead? I mean, what I will say is this. Before the internet was around, there were a lot of stories, well, people don't like high culture because it's just too costly to buy opera tickets or whatever. Anyway, now that we got YouTube, we know that's wrong. It was always pretty suspicious, right? It's like, well, can't they go to the library and check out some opera records? How expensive is that? Anyway, now that all high culture on earth is really totally free, you could do it all day, every day. The story that the reason why stuff on TV is lowbrow is that people are just deeply lowbrow now totally crushes the other more idealistic story that lots of people would just love to go and explore high culture if only it were not so expensive. It's now zero, so people still are barely doing it. So that's the main story to have there. In terms of schools crushing curiosity, I think the best version of that story is that you can't be curious if you don't have free time, and schools take away almost all your free time. So that's kind of the best story. But still, I would say that we can take a look at college, where most college students we know from time use surveys have a ton of free time. And when they get a ton of free time, they don't seem to spend much of it on what we think of as intellectual curiosity. Rather, it's like drinking and parties and goofing off in video games. Again, you could always say, well, if they had more fostering their curiosity during their K-12 years, then when they got to college, it'd be different. But this is a point where it's like almost nothing seems to count. How about summer vacation? Like people keep doing non-curious stuff during summer vacation, does that mean anything to you? What would it take? I mean, the main story that people have here, there's sort of like one kind of evidence that's probably at least some of the more on point for the most extreme scenarios is unschooling. So there are actually places where you just drop your kid off and let them do whatever. Right? And the usual story there is, well, like some kids just play video games all day, but most of them don't. And all right, maybe. I do tend to think that people who are running these schools are so committed to it and so dogmatic that they just will not admit that things are not turning out the way they want. So if kids don't learn math, they're like, oh, well, apparently math was not important for them. 5-year-old decides that he doesn't want a job that involves math. All right, I guess we should respect that. Well, obviously, a 5-year-old has a deep understanding of his career options. And so if he thinks that math is not worthwhile for him, he's right. On the other hand, maybe 5-year-olds don't know what's going on.
Do you think that societal norms and expectations, like the concept of soulmates and these more ethereal Hollywood sense of what a relationship should be, distort the dating and marriage market, making it less efficient?
It's a good question. There's a lot of distortions. So the distortions that people think about are you're in a relationship and then your expectations are too high. And I guess you could say that media does that. But on the other hand, I think the actual biggest distortion is loneliness and people that are just so full of social anxiety that they are afraid to ask. And in this sense, you could say that all of this setting expectations really high is helpful because it gives people this idea, well, if I could just get my courage up, then incredible things will happen, just like in the movies. I think then that's like the net effect, I think is pretty complicated, actually. I mean, like my usual view about human beings is they're highly impulsive. They put too much weight on the short term relative to the long term, which means that on the one hand, when you're in a relationship, people tend to say, well, I'm mad at you now because you're falling short of incredibly high standards. So maybe we should break up and then I'll find somebody better. It's like, well, that's wrong, at least most of the time. But on the other hand, there's also people like, I'm too scared even to say hello. It's like, well, let me show you some romantic comedies to give you some hope that things will work out.
What would your actual message to the broader public look like to decrease this loneliness and anxiety? Would it be as explicit as like your post, she's the one or he's the one, or would it be some romanticized version of that?
My specialty is just being totally candid with people. That's what I'm good at. I don't think that if I wanted to become a bombastic liar, I just think I would suck at it. Like other people have been practicing being bombastic liars their whole lives. I've spent the last 35 years or so really trying to get to the truth as literally as I can. Like that's my effort anyway. That's my goal. That's what I am at least bad at, is just being totally candid with people. I would say that when I'm explaining this to people, I try to have positive affect, probably try to be friendly and say things that are true. Like lots of people who are uglier than you have girlfriends. And I'm not lying when I say that. It's like, that's literally true. Just look around with your eyes. There's all kinds of ugly guys who have women who love them. So why not you? What's wrong with you? Just pull yourself together and try. And, that's the kind of thing I would say, but I would say that's literal truth. If I do have any rhetorical technique that I think works well for me, it's just humor. I feel good about that. As you might know, I've tried stand-up comedy. To me, like if I'm with people that I can't joke with, I'm just not happy. I like telling jokes. I like hearing jokes. I like just wording things in a way that's funny just to get the point across. That's a big part of me. I think about the question, what is it about me that is true, me in real life that is not obvious from my writings? I think probably it is the sense of humor where like I just like to be laughing all day, all the time, really. If things aren't funny, I feel like this is not where I want to be. I want to be with the funny people.
Is potential in the dating or marriage market correctly priced? You seem to advocate a very market-oriented approach for people to have a greater understanding of what they want and what they're offering. Is there an advantage to developing alongside another individual, or should people wait until they have already done some sort of career development and then entering these sorts of markets?
I'd say that my main view is that human beings' main problem is loneliness. And so I just say, like, start as soon as you can get the words out of your mouth to say hello. Well, there's a lot of learning going on, but the first step is just saying, hi, I'm Bryan. What's your name? That's what I would focus on. I mean, like there is the truth is, of course, there's heterogeneity. There's a small share of the population that is very outgoing, very comfortable with usually himself. And those people, my main advice to them is, you don't need my advice. You're fine. Maybe if you're having some problems, come to me, but I think that you are so ahead of the game. In terms of whether people are properly priced, yeah, I would say no. I mean, here's the thing. So you know about arbitrage. The way that arbitrage works so well in stock markets is that one super rich, super knowledgeable person can move the market. One person who knows better than everyone else can change everything, like in the movie The Big Short. Right? That's not just fiction. It's fictionalized, but it's not fiction. On the other hand, in the dating market, no one person is that important. Even the biggest Lothario dates like 10,000 women over the course of his life. All right, that's like Wilt Chamberlain or something like that. 10,000 is a super tiny share of the market. So arbitrage does not work that well in these kinds of one-on-one barter markets. It does something, but just not that much. I mean, so there are so many arbitrage opportunities when you start paying attention. I mean, like one of the most obvious ones is that colleges have the world's most desirable women. And guess what? They are surrounded by a bunch of guys who are not all that desirable in the eyes of the world. So college-age guys have an incredible advantage just by proximity to the most desirable women. Part of this, like you say, well, in a college town, what can you do? But yeah, like if you're in not a college town, if you're in a city, it's like, I think I would tend to tell college-age women, I mean, unless some college-age guy is just off the charts, like, why are you dating him? There's just way better guys around. So why not focus on them instead? This is the common view of what happens to college dating in New York City, where they're just so closely connected to the rest of the city that it's the advantage that guys get from being in college is just a lot less than it would be almost anywhere else. But I would start with there. I mean, like some of the other things that I've talked about, I think that especially young people just put way too much weight on physical attraction. It's easy to say, but look, this is one where you said, look, imagine you're with someone who's incredibly attractive, but they have a terrible personality. How long will it take before you are miserable with them all day, every day? It's like a month. Okay, so like this isn't a big insight really, but it's one that especially guys seem to have a big problem acting on. So yeah, there's way too much emphasis on extremely physically attractive women, also on men, but I think more on women, and way too little emphasis on personality. Right? Pretty obvious point, but it's not being priced in, again, probably because of that impulsivity. So for a lot of people, what gets over their short run aversion to sticking their necks out and saying hello is just, oh my God, this person is incredibly good looking. Okay, I will, for that sake, go over and speak. Whereas to appreciate a personality takes more time and therefore isn't as motivating in the immediate run, even though if you really think about it, won't you be much happier with a person of average looks who has a great personality? So why aren't you trying to find great personalities, which do exist, of course. There's enormous variety of personality, probably among young people, bigger variety of personality than of looks, actually. I also am often telling young people, like, you have no idea how good looking you are. Like in 50 and even in 20 years, you'll look back and say, wow, I look great. You may look in the mirror now and be dissatisfied, but you're near your peak.
You've talked about the thought that you put into the wording and release of your recent collection of essays called Don't Be a Feminist in 2022. Mm-hmm. Do you think cancel culture has peaked? Would the reception have been the same in the 2016, 2017 era?
Yeah, good question. Whenever people talk about an idea peaking, my question is always like a global peak, like for all of time, it's never going to get anywhere higher than it already is? Or are we talking about like a local maximum where it's high right now and it's going down a bit, but of course it's going to have another time that it jumps up again? The idea that cancel culture peaked for all time in 2020, I think that's crazy. There's just way too much time left. Did it peak for my lifetime in 2020? I hope so, but I think that's still unlikely. I've just got too many years left to think that there won't be some other shocking events that will once again galvanize the conscience of the innumerate world. Would the reaction have been different in 2016? Yeah, probably it would have. That I'd say that was sort of the peak of the feminist branch of cancel culture. That was a time. So it turns out the most oppressed group on earth are attractive women. It was like, that's weird, right? And then George Floyd came along and says, nope, sorry, attractive women have been demoted way down. And now it's back to at least a group where they do have low income and high unemployment and a bunch of other serious problems. Whereas the idea that attractive women were ever an especially oppressed group is almost hard to fathom to me. I don't know if you remember, I've done a number of surveys just asking people if you could choose your own attractiveness on a 0 to 10 scale, knowing that you would get all the good parts and all the bad parts of whatever your choice is, what level of attractiveness would you choose? And I was actually surprised that both men and women, by far the most popular answer is 10.
Really? Wow.
Yes, I was thinking that women would 8 or 9, feeling like 10 is too much. And because again, I did explicitly call attention to this will give you everything good about the attractiveness and everything bad, just to remind you. But actually, the by far most popular view is that I don't care about these downsides. They are not important compared to the upsides. I want to be a 10.
Is that just an artifact of short-term versus long-term thinking?
Good question. I mean, like the way the question is posed is designed to actually draw out long-term thinking. It is a hypothetical. So you figure a hypothetical question, people will have a little bit more distance from it. And then furthermore, actually, it's kind of an ugly thing to say. Like, I really want to be as physically attractive as possible. That's really important to me. I was expecting people just to go and say, oh no, like, I want to be valued for me. I don't want to just have people pawing at me because I'm so incredibly good looking. But actually, people seem to be quite willing to say it in spite of it not sounding all that good.
In what ways do you see yourself as an intellectual arbitrager, saying things that other people aren't willing to say?
Mm-hmm.
In some Austrian economics view, I know that you don't formally identify with them anymore. Isn't this some sort of low-hanging fruit that people should be taking advantage of?
Right. So the way that I think about it is that the easiest fruit to pick is stuff that is true but ugly. Ugly truths are the easiest to get truths. And that's what almost all of my work focuses on, is ugly truths. When you say that like there's an arbitrage opportunity, I guess my view is that for most people, it's not, because most people just wouldn't know what to do with an ugly truth. Most people would just feel so uncomfortable. They would be so cringing and apologizing that they just would not be effective users of the ugly truths. You need to combine willingness to work on it with a certain personality type, which, like, I will just say, I have always been an iconoclast. When people say this is sacred, my knee-jerk reaction is, no, it's not. Or, I spit on whatever you hold sacred. And that is my knee-jerk reaction. I do try to say, well, just because it's sacred to them doesn't mean it's wrong. Maybe it's right, but nevertheless, that is my personality type. I'm happy to admit that. When I compare myself to other people that I know, like I often say, out of all my friends in high school, I consider myself to have been the dumbest. Out of my immediate group of professors, I think probably I am the dumbest, the lowest in IQ. I think that most of the success that I have comes from this iconoclasm, combined with, I do think that my creativity is unusually high. But even that is really closely tied to iconoclasm, because like a lot of my creativity comes down to, well, what are the things that seem true that people aren't willing to say? And then I can come up and say, here's my original idea, when it's probably not really original so much as other people are scared to say it and I'm not. So it looks original because I put my stamp on it. But the idea that no one else has thought these things before, I feel like they must have. They were just too scared to say anything about it.
You've written books, academic papers, and appeared on TV, amongst other appearances. Have you found a specific channel that more effectively broadcasts economic ideas, or do you think this is sort of a portfolio of your work where each channel is distributed to a very specific group of people?
My main impression is that people consider my writing to be my best, followed by the speaking. Though the speaking, I would say I would have very few speaking opportunities without the writing. Normally what happens is people read my stuff and then they like it. And then they got some money and they say, hey, will you go and fly out to Wrocław, Poland and talk about real estate? If I didn't have the writing, then I don't think those offers would be coming in. And most of my public speaking would just be limited to teaching and maybe podcasts like this one. Wait, so what am I getting for this again? Oh yeah, right. Podcast generally totally free. It's super fun. I mean, obviously it's a lot easier just to chat with you than to fly to another country or something like that. If someone were saying like, how can I optimize this? I mean, I think I would normally say focus on the writing. That's the thing where you can always do it. You don't need to wait around for a social opportunity to write. And then when opportunities to speak to others come along, or be on TV, then jump at that, especially if it's a big audience. That's how, I guess, how I would urge people to go and develop their careers is start by doing the things that are easiest to do on your own and make a name for yourself that way. And then more opportunities will come along and you can then cash in on those as well. That's the main picture I would have there.
You've talked about how academics often have the attitude, if I write a paper, they will read it. There's a sense in industry that if I build it, the users will come. You've said in the marriage market, it's mostly about marketing, which people often forget. Yep. Why is marketing seemingly underrated across life in general? Is it culturally low status or is there something more innate about it?
I'm going to go back to impulsivity. Marketing hurts. You're basically facing a pile of rejection. Just imagine here's 100 phone numbers. If you call them all, you'll get one good date. And the people that hang up on you, you'll never hear from them again. They won't remember you. It's like, wow, like, I don't want to do that, right? They're like that's hard, is to best be rejected 99 times for one success. So I think that is a big part of the aversion to marketing is the totally reasonable fear of rejection. One great thing about the internet is it has reduced the sting of rejection. It hurts a lot less to be ignored over email than to go and talk to a person and say hello and have them just walk past you as if you don't exist. Like you are not even worthy of me saying no to. So that's a big part of it. In academia, at least, the real story is that you can get well above the bar with very little marketing. You just get your 7 crummy publications in a referee journal, and then you get your dream job for life. If you're ambitious, obviously you need to do more than that. But of course, most professors are not ambitious. They're just looking to go and have a stable mid-level career. They're not trying to set the world on fire. And therefore, professors don't really need to market very much. It's only if you actually have something that would be interesting to a broader audience to say that you'll even get much out of it. I mean, essentially, I would say that it's multiplicative. So if you've got something interesting and you market, you multiply 2 good things together and you get a lot. But on the other hand, if the actual interestingness of your work is 0, you could go and try marketing it all the time. It's not going to do any good because nobody will care about that stuff. So you got to think about those 2 things working together and just remember what most professors do is just so intrinsically boring. Something that at best is interesting only to specialists. People sometimes get annoyed when I say things like this and say, oh, it can't really be that bad. And my advice is, all right, go to Google Scholar, type in the names of your professors and see what they've done with their lives. And especially look at the citation count. And you will see like most of what professors do. First of all, most professors barely do anything with their careers. They write enough for tenure and not much else. But on top of it, the number of citations that most professors have is so low because no one else who specializes in that topic considers that to be worth even mentioning in their own work.
Final question. If I were to generally characterize your advice and ideas, that they generally fall along a spectrum of instincts versus rationalism. On the instinct side, some things are just so obviously true. To get good at a language, you have to work a ton harder and make a ton of mistakes. On the rationalism side, you provide a convincing argument that maybe anarcho-capitalism isn't too crazy through a certain lens. Do you think most of these ideas come instinctually to you?
I would say it's almost all rationalism. I don't think of the way to learn a foreign language is to try really hard as being an instinct. I would think of that as it's something where when you think about it, it's pretty obviously true. But it's not the instinct that most people have. Most people's instinct is, if I want to learn a language, I go to a class and do what they say. And that's wrong. Right? If all you do is go to your language class and do what they say, you will never learn the language. You've got to do so much more than that if you want to have any hope of learning it. The main difference between me and other people think of themselves as rationalists is I do try to just keep my eyes open and think about what would be obvious to people that are just paying attention to what they see with their own two eyes. I mean, I'd say that's really the beginning of science and reason, is paying attention to the real world. There are a lot of rationalists, though, who are super good at logic, but they're not good at looking at paying attention to the world and seeing what really goes on. The idea of pay attention to base rates, that's great advice. Like, well, what's going to happen? Okay, well, what normally happens? But I would still say that there are a lot of rationalists who are more like Descartes, and they'll just say, okay, I'm going to start with I think, therefore I am, and try to deduce everything from that. And it's like, yeah, guess what? You can't actually deduce much from that. If you've ever read Descartes, it's like, wow, this guy is able to prove some of the most original math that was ever done at that time. And yet these arguments are so bad, I'm almost crying from tears from the laughter. It's like what? Like, Descartes, how could you say this stuff? It's so obviously, transparently, desperately wrong. And it was like, well, but I had to prove it using what I had. I couldn't just sit around believing the physical world didn't exist. So I came up with this whole argument about how God can be derived from my own thinking, and then God wouldn't deceive me. So yada, yada, yada. Uh, in general, I would say that if there's any role that instincts play in my thinking, it's just to say that pay attention. Human beings do have instincts, obviously. Things as basic as people tend to like other people that are nice to them. All right. Like, if that's not instinctive, what is? Or it's like people like sugary and salty food, highly instinctive. So do pay attention to instincts, but I would still say it's a rationalist take on instincts, where you need to pay attention to your instincts and assess them and say, all right, this is something that helped your genes to survive over the last million years, but is it functional for you now in the current strange environment that we find ourselves in?
Ryan, thanks for your time.
All right, Ryan. Yeah, this has been awesome. These are great questions. I love the way your mind thinks.
Where can people learn more about your work?
All of my many books are available on Amazon.com. Also, I blog for Bet On It on Substack. And finally, I've got a webpage for my writings, which is just bcaplan.com. So if you want to find out more, try that.
Thank you.